Have you ever noticed how many people say they want to do something, but somehow they never start? They talk about writing the book. They talk about starting the business. They talk about learning the skill. They talk about changing their life. And the strange thing is most of them truly want it. They are not lying. They are not pretending. They genuinely want the better life they describe. Yet months pass, years pass, sometimes an entire lifetime passes. And the idea, the dream, the thing they once felt excited about stays exactly where it began, inside their head. Now, most people think the reason for this is obvious. They say, I'm waiting for the right time. Or they say, I just need to prepare a little more. Or maybe they say, I'm not ready yet. And we hear those words so often that they start to sound reasonable. But tonight I want to challenge something, because the real reason people never start is not the one they think. The real reason is something far more powerful and far more invisible. The real reason people never start is because they believe there is a barrier, a wall, something standing between where they are and where they want to go. And this belief is so strong that it shapes every decision they make. They believe they must first become ready. They believe they must first become confident. They believe they must first become capable. Only then they think, will they finally begin? But here is the uncomfortable truth. That barrier, the one they think exists, does not exist. Think about it. When a child learns to walk, they do not sit down and say, let me study balance first. They do not read a book called The Complete Strategy of Walking. They don't wait until they feel confident. They try, they fall. They try again, they fall again. And eventually they walk. The ability did not come before the action. The ability came because of the action. Yet somewhere along the way, as we grow older, something strange happens. We begin to believe that action must wait for certainty. We begin to believe that we must eliminate risk before we begin. We begin to believe that the people who succeed must somehow feel ready before they start. But if you speak to people who have built things, who have created things, who have changed things, they will tell you something surprising. They were not ready either. They were uncertain. They were afraid. They were confused. And they started anyway. You see, the greatest lie we tell ourselves is this: I will start when I feel ready. But readiness is not a prerequisite for action. Readiness is a result of action. Confidence does not come before doing the thing. Confidence comes after doing the thing again and again and again. Think about the first time you tried anything difficult. The first time you spoke in front of people. The first time you attempted something you had never done before. You were nervous. You were unsure. Your mind was filled with questions. And yet somehow you did it. Not perfectly. Not smoothly. But you did it. And after you did it, once something changed, the fear did not disappear, but it shrank. The unknown became a little more familiar. And suddenly the thing that once felt impossible started to feel manageable. Now imagine if you had waited until you felt fully confident before that first attempt. You would still be waiting. And that is where millions of people are today. Waiting. Waiting for the perfect plan. Waiting for the perfect moment. Waiting for the perfect version of themselves. But perfection is not the starting point. Perfection is not even the destination. Progress begins with something much smaller. A step. Just one step. The funny thing about fear is that it pretends to be a wall. It feels solid. It feels immovable. But when you actually move toward it, when you actually take a step, you realize something surprising. It was never a wall. It was smoke. And the moment you walk through, it disappears. Now I want to talk about something deeper, because the barrier that people think exists is not just fear. It is identity. Most people believe that the people who succeed are somehow different. They believe those people are naturally brave, naturally talented, naturally confident. They imagine that those individuals were born with something they themselves do not have. And that belief becomes another barrier. But if you look closely at anyone who has ever done something meaningful, you will see a pattern. They did not start as the person capable of doing it. They became that person through the process. The entrepreneur was not always an entrepreneur. The leader was not always a leader. The artist was not always an artist. They became those things by starting before they felt worthy of the title. Identity is not something you discover. Identity is something you build. Every action you take is a vote for the kind of person you are becoming. And when you delay action, when you wait for permission, when you wait for certainty, you delay becoming the person you could be. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. What if I fail? It is a fair question. In fact, it is the question that stops most people. But I want you to consider something. Failure is not the opposite of success. Failure is the process of success. Every attempt that does not work teaches you something the next attempt requires. Every mistake gives you information. Every wrong turn gives you direction. The only true failure is never beginning. Because if you never begin, you never learn. You never adapt. You never grow. And the version of yourself that might have existed never gets the chance to appear. The world is filled with invisible potential. Ideas that were never started, books that were never written, businesses that were never created, solutions that were never discovered. Not because people lacked intelligence, not because they lacked ability, but because they believed in a barrier that was never there. And that belief kept them standing still. So the question becomes, how do we break this pattern? How do we move from hesitation to action? The answer is simpler than most people expect. You stop waiting. You stop negotiating with fear. You stop asking for certainty. And you start small. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Now. You take one step. Just one. You write the first page. You make the first call. You build the first version. You try. And then you learn. And then you try again. Momentum is a powerful force, but momentum only appears after movement begins. Once you take that first step, something incredible happens. Your brain shifts. The impossible begins to feel possible. The distant goal begins to feel closer. And the person you once imagined being begins to emerge in real life. But none of that happens until you start. Let me tell you something important. The world does not reward the people who think about doing things. The world rewards the people who do them. Ideas are everywhere. Intentions are everywhere. Dreams are everywhere. Action is rare. And that is why action is powerful. Because the moment you take action, you separate yourself from the majority of people who never will. You step into a different category. You become someone who moves, someone who tries, someone who builds. And those people, the ones who start before they feel ready, are the ones who eventually create the things the rest of the world admires. Now imagine something for a moment. Imagine if the barrier you believe exists truly does not exist. Imagine that the only difference between the life you have and the life you want is the moment you decide to begin. Imagine that the fear in your mind is not a warning, but simply a signal that you are standing at the edge of growth. Because that is exactly what it is. Fear does not mean stop. Fear often means forward. It means you are approaching something meaningful, something unfamiliar, something that could transform you. But transformation only happens when we step into the unknown. And the truth is, nobody ever feels completely ready. Nobody ever eliminates doubt. Nobody ever reaches a moment where every risk disappears. The people who change their lives are not the ones without fear. They are the ones who move despite it. They understand something that most people never realize. They understand that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is action in the presence of fear. So if you are waiting for the fear to disappear, you will wait forever. But if you decide that fear is allowed to come along for the ride, you will start today. And once you start, everything changes. Your confidence grows. Your knowledge expands. Your identity shifts. The path that once seemed invisible begins to reveal itself step by step, not all at once, but enough to keep moving, enough to keep building, enough to keep becoming. And years from now, when you look back, you will not remember the fear as the thing that stopped you. You will remember it as the moment you decided to move anyway. So if there is one idea I want you to carry with you tonight, it is this. The barrier you believe is standing in your way is an illusion. It is a story your mind created to protect you from uncertainty. But that story does not have to control your life. You can rewrite it right now. You can decide that you do not need permission. You do not need perfection. You do not need certainty. All you need is the willingness to begin. Because the moment you begin, you prove something powerful to yourself. You prove that the wall was never real. And once you realize that, there is nothing left between you and the life you are capable of creating. So start. Even if the step is small, even if the path is unclear, even if your hands are shaking, start. Because the barrier does not exist. It never did. And the only thing that has ever been waiting is you. And there is another truth that quietly follows everything we have been talking about. Self-mastery is louder than self-promotion. The strongest message you can send to the world is not what you say, but who you become. And right next to that truth is another one that many people don't realize until much later in life. Unfinished ideas cost more than failed attempts. Regret rarely comes from trying and falling short. Regret almost always comes from something else entirely. It comes from never discovering what could have happened. Think about that for a moment. Not the mistakes you made. Not the time something didn't work. But the things you never tried. The idea you had but never started. The opportunity you saw but never pursued. The version of yourself you imagined but never allowed to exist in the real world. Those are the things that stay with people. Those are the quiet thoughts that appear years later when life slows down enough for reflection. You see, failure has a strange quality. It hurts in the moment. It can be uncomfortable. Sometimes it even feels embarrassing. But failure eventually fades. You learn from it. You move past it. You grow from it. And one day, it becomes a story, a lesson, something you can look back on and say, that experience taught me something important. But unfinished ideas don't behave the same way. They linger. They stay unresolved. They remain a question mark in your mind. And question marks have a way of echoing through time. What if I had tried? What if I had started? What if I had taken that risk? Those questions don't disappear easily, because the mind dislikes unfinished stories. Human beings are wired to seek closure. We want to know how things end. We want to see the full picture. But when an idea never becomes action, the story never begins. And when the story never begins, the ending never arrives. Which means the mind continues returning to that same place again, and again, and again. Imagine someone who had an idea for something meaningful. Maybe it was a project. Maybe it was a business. Maybe it was something creative. Maybe it was a way to help people. The idea appeared one day, clear and exciting. For a moment, the future felt alive with possibility. They imagined where it could go. They imagined the impact it might have. They imagined the kind of person they might become if they pursued it. But then something happened. A familiar voice appeared. The voice of doubt. The voice of hesitation. Maybe later. I'm not ready yet. What if it doesn't work? What if people judge me? And little by little, the idea was placed aside. Not rejected, just postponed. And postponement is one of the most dangerous decisions we make, because postponement feels harmless. It feels temporary. It feels responsible. We tell ourselves we will come back to it when the time is right, when we have more experience, when we have more resources, when life is less busy. But life rarely becomes less busy. Responsibilities grow, commitments expand, the space we once had slowly disappears. And that idea, the one that once felt powerful, begins to fade. Not because it wasn't meaningful, but because it was never given the chance to live outside the mind. Now here is something fascinating about ideas. Ideas are fragile in the beginning. When they first appear, they are small, uncertain, unformed. They need attention, they need action, they need experimentation. Without those things, they slowly weaken, and eventually they disappear. Not with a dramatic moment, not with a clear ending, just quietly. One day the excitement is gone, and the person moves on with life. But years later, something interesting happens. A memory appears. Maybe they see someone doing something similar. Maybe they read about a project that reminds them of the idea they once had. Maybe they hear someone talk about a path they themselves considered long ago, and suddenly the mind returns to that unfinished moment. The thought appears again. I had an idea like that once, and with it comes another thought. What if I had tried? Now imagine the weight of that question, not once, not twice, but repeated across many moments in life, across many ideas, across many opportunities. One unfinished idea might not seem significant, but over time they accumulate. 1 becomes 5, 5 become 10, 10 become a lifetime of possibilities that were never explored. And this is where regret begins to form, not from failure, but from absence. The absence of attempts, the absence of courage, the absence of discovery. Because when you attempt something, even if it doesn't work, you gain something valuable. You gain knowledge, you gain experience, you gain understanding about yourself, you gain stories. But when you never attempt it, you gain nothing. Just speculation, just imagination, just the endless question of what might have been. Think about the people you admire, the people who build things, create things, lead things. Do you believe everything they attempted succeeded? Of course not. Every person who accomplishes something meaningful carries a long list of failures behind them. Projects that didn't work, ideas that collapsed, experiments that failed. But those failures served a purpose. They shaped the person. They sharpened their thinking. They developed their resilience. They transformed uncertainty into wisdom. Every failed attempt moved them one step closer to something better. And most importantly, every attempt gave them closure. They knew what worked. They knew what didn't. They knew the result. There was no mystery, no lingering doubt, just learning. Now compare that with someone who never tries. They avoid failure. They avoid embarrassment. They avoid risk. But they also avoid discovery. They avoid growth. They avoid the possibility of becoming more than they currently are. And the cost of that avoidance is invisible at first. It does not appear immediately. It shows up slowly, years later, when reflection becomes unavoidable, when people begin looking backward as much as they look forward. And in those quiet moments, the mind begins reviewing the past, not just what happened, but what didn't happen, the conversations that never took place, the chances that were never taken, the dreams that never left the imagination. And that is when the true cost of unfinished ideas becomes clear, because by that point, time has already moved forward. Opportunities change, circumstances shift, energy is not the same, and the realization becomes unavoidable. The moment to explore that idea existed once, but it was never used. Now here's the remarkable part. This pattern repeats across generations, across cultures, across professions. It happens to intelligent people. It happens to talented people. It happens to capable people. Because the barrier was never ability. The barrier was hesitation. The barrier was waiting for certainty. The barrier was believing that failure would be worse than inaction. But history tells a different story. The individuals who shape the future are rarely the ones who waited for the perfect moment. They are the ones who experimented, who tested ideas, who allowed themselves to fail, who understood that an unfinished idea is far more dangerous than a failed one, Because failure can be analyzed, failure can be improved. Failure can be transformed into progress. But an unfinished idea cannot evolve. It cannot adapt. It cannot grow. It remains frozen in the moment it was imagined. And over time, that frozen moment becomes heavier. It becomes a reminder. A reminder of courage that was never used, of curiosity that was never explored, of potential that was never expressed. Imagine carrying that weight across decades. Imagine collecting dozens of those moments, ideas that once felt alive, but were quietly buried. You might succeed in many areas of life. You might build stability. You might achieve comfort. But deep down there may still be a question, a quiet voice asking something simple. What would have happened if I had tried? And that question is powerful, because it cannot be answered anymore. There is no data, no experience, no story, just imagination. Now contrast that with someone who decides to attempt their ideas, not perfectly, not fearlessly, but honestly. They take an idea and they test it. They give it time. They experiment. Maybe it fails. Maybe it succeeds. But either way, they gain clarity. They gain knowledge. They gain direction. And most importantly, they gain peace, because the story has an ending. The question has an answer, even if the answer is, that path was not for me. There is freedom in knowing, freedom in having explored the possibility, freedom in closing the loop, which means the mind no longer needs to return to that moment again and again. The energy once trapped in uncertainty is released, and that energy can now move toward the next idea, the next opportunity, the next experiment. This is how growth actually works. Not through perfect plans, but through cycles of action and learning. Action creates feedback. Feedback creates understanding. Understanding creates better action. And with each cycle, the person becomes stronger, more capable, more aware, more confident in navigating the unknown. But none of that happens when ideas remain unfinished, because unfinished ideas never enter the cycle. They stay trapped in imagination, and imagination alone cannot produce transformation. Transformation requires engagement with reality. It requires the courage to move from thinking to doing, to move from possibility to experiment, to move from dream to attempt. And when you begin treating ideas as experiments rather than guarantees, something changes. The fear of failure begins to shrink, because the goal is no longer perfection. The goal becomes discovery. Instead of asking, what if this fails? You begin asking, what might I learn? Instead of asking, what will people think? You begin asking, what could become possible? And suddenly the cost of trying feels smaller, because the value of learning becomes greater. But the cost of unfinished ideas remains enormous, because every unfinished idea represents a potential version of yourself that never had the chance to exist. Every attempt shapes identity. Every challenge reveals capability. Every experiment builds mastery. And mastery is never created through discussion. It is created through practice, through repeated engagement with difficulty, through trial and error, through persistence. That is why self-mastery speaks louder than self-promotion, because people eventually notice results, not promises, not intentions, but results. The person who quietly works on their craft, day after day, eventually reaches a level that cannot be ignored. The person who repeatedly tests ideas, learns from mistakes, and improves eventually builds something meaningful. And when that happens, the world begins to pay attention. Not because the person announced their ambitions, but because their actions revealed their commitment. Their growth became visible. Their discipline became undeniable. Their mastery became their message. And mastery always begins with attempts. Many attempts that succeed, attempts that fail, attempts that evolve. But all of them moving forward, all of them transforming ideas into experience, which means the true risk in life is not failure. The true risk is leaving ideas unfinished, leaving curiosity unexplored, leaving potential untested, because time moves whether we act or not. Opportunities pass whether we notice them or not. And the version of ourselves that might exist 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, is shaped by the choices we make today. Not the ideas we imagine, but the actions we take. Every idea you pursue expands the boundaries of who you can become. Every idea you abandon before attempting narrows those boundaries. So the real question is not whether an idea will succeed. The real question is whether you are willing to discover the answer. Because discovery only belongs to those who attempt. And every attempt moves life forward. Even the unsuccessful ones, even the messy ones, even the uncertain ones, they all contribute to growth. They all contribute to mastery. They all contribute to a life that contains stories rather than speculation. A life filled with experiences rather than unanswered questions. A life where ideas are explored rather than stored away. And the difference between those two lives is not talent. It is not luck. It is not intelligence. It is simply the decision to test ideas instead of protecting them. To bring them into reality instead of leaving them inside imagination. To risk failure instead of guaranteeing regret. Because unfinished ideas carry a quiet cost that grows heavier over time. And the longer they remain unfinished, the louder the question becomes. What could have happened if you had tried?